What happens when love, family, and faith are put on trial? For Kody Brown, the star of Sister Wives, the courtroom wasn't just about laws. It was about the fight for his family's very survival. This is the secret history of how one man's secret life became a public courtroom fight that stunned the nation. This is not sensationalized plotline for a TV series. It was real-life hell for Kody Brown, the man the world got to know from the popular TLC reality show Sister Wives. Everything seemed perfect at first glance for Kody and his family, who appeared to be reality TV stars living an unorthodox but joyful existence. But out of the public eye, beyond the artfully constructed interviews, and in the confines of their own walls, was a growing shadow each and every day. That shadow was the courthouse, the hanging specter of law, judgment, and penalty. For the rest of us, marriage is an intimate decision. We decide whom we love, with whom we live, and how we create our families. But for Kody Brown, such decisions did not merely shape his household, they also shaped a controversy that would land him and his wives on the front page of tabloids and in the sights of prosecutors. When Sister Wives first aired in 2010, millions were immediately enthralled. This was a family unlike any other on TV. One husband, 4 wives, and over a dozen children, all sharing a single unorthodox but tight-knit household. It was sensational. It was tear-jerking. And it was something that most viewers had never seen before. But to Kody, it wasn't entertainment. It was his life, his faith, his beliefs, his family. He wasn't attempting to shock the world. He was just in his own mind, being honest about the love and nuance of his home. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly that honesty would turn around and bite him. The cameras bestowed glory. The cameras brought riches. But the cameras also brought peril. Within the span of a single night, Kody and his wives transitioned from a quiet Utah family to the public face of contemporary polygamy in America. And that public light put them squarely in the face of an implacable foe, the law itself. Prior to Sister Wives, the Browns had long lived in secret. Polygamy was not only disapproved of in Utah, but illegal. Families such as the Browns lived in secrecy, avoiding attention, concealing the real nature of their lives, and living with the constant threat of a knock at the door that would alter everything. Picture bringing up your kids, sending them to school, and eating around the dinner table each evening, while having the shadow of one unknown phone call to the police hanging over you, threatening charges of bigamy, jail time, or having your children removed. That was the specter that loomed over the Browns each and every day. But when TLC knocked on their door, inviting them to share their story on national TV, Kody and his wives made a brave choice. They came out of the shadows. They were sure that if the world could get to know them as a normal, functioning family, rather than as criminals, the stigma would vanish. Perhaps they hoped people would realize that this wasn't about crime, it was about choice. But in deciding to share their truth, they also put a big bullseye on their backs. And Utah officials were paying attention. As Sister Wives attracted viewers, something else was building steam. The state's investigation of the Browns. Officials were making inquiries. Could Kody be charged with bigamy? Could his wives be prosecuted? Was the show itself proof of a crime? This wasn't about the law, it was about reputation. About fear, about the safety of the entire family. Every time the Browns went to the news, every time they scrolled through online stories, they saw their names caught up in controversy. The world wasn't just interested in them, it was judging them. The Browns didn't hide. Rather, they rolled with their narrative. But even as they continued to produce more episodes, as they invited viewers into their lives, the tension was building. You could see it in Kody's expression, the burden of knowing that cameras might someday roll not a joyful family reunion, but the sight of a raid, a trial, or even prison time. It was a strange paradox. The same show that had made them famous was also the evidence that would kill them. What made it even more dramatic was the human element to it all. Behind the courtroom drama, behind the news headlines were actual human beings, wives and kids, who didn't want to be the focus of a legal firestorm. Christine, Janelle, Meri, and Robin were more than just co-stars. They were women attempting to rear children, manage relationships, and maintain harmony in a home that most people couldn't even hope to keep. And while the show dabbled in jealousy, love, and family intrigue, the true adversary was the one standing at their door in the guise of prosecutors. For the kids, the stress was even more severe. They had to endure questions no child should have to deal with. Will dad end up in jail? Will our family be split up? Will people judge us as criminals simply because of where we grew up? These weren't television reality show storylines. These were emotional wounds of living in a family that was under perpetual threat of being torn apart by the law. Soon the Browns realized they could not simply sit around and await prosecution. They needed to strike back. They needed to take their tale from reality television and into the courtroom, where the consequences were greater than any season's finale. But this was not a choice made lightly. Suing the state of Utah meant taking their personal pain and making it public battle. It meant taking on decades-old laws, and it meant putting everything at risk. Because when you go to court, you can't hide. But Kody and his wives felt like they had no other option. In order to save their family, in order to save their right to live by their religion, they needed to become reality TV personalities, but also legal fighters. And thus started one of the most remarkable stories in reality television history, a narrative in which the courtroom show was even more sensational than anything that could be written by the producers. The Browns' tale didn't start with triumph, it didn't start with success. It started with fear, concealment, and the type of suspense that no family should endure. But by sharing their story, by being willing to step into the spotlight, they ignited a blaze that would fan out far beyond their own home. Their battle wasn't for them alone, it was the battle to decide on love without the threat of prosecution. And while the path ahead would be long, complex, and sorrowful, this start, the startling, dramatic, and perilous start, laid the groundwork for all that was to come. For Kody Brown, the courtroom was not merely a structure. It was a war zone, and his family's survival was dependent upon how far he was prepared to go. When Sister Wives initially landed on TV screens in 2010, the Browns were overnight sensations. Fans from millions tuned in to see their unusual household, a father, 4 wives, and an increasing number of children, make it through the day. It was a ratings bonanza for TLC. It was a glimpse into a life fans had only heard rumor of. But not everybody was amused. Behind the grins, behind the family meals and tearful admissions, Utah officials were taking note. Unlike the people watching from home, they weren't concerned with the Browns' tales of love or parenting woes. They cared to know if the Browns were violating the law. In Utah, polygamy was, and continued to be in many variations, a crime. The Browns had lived quietly with that fact for years, concealing their home life discreetly to steer clear of trouble. But by appearing on a reality show, they had blown their cover. Now, prosecutors had video proof of their lifestyle on national television. The Browns were now unexpectedly under scrutiny for possible charges of bigamy, which could bring prison time. It wasn't just Kody himself in jeopardy, his wives could be punished too. And what was perhaps the biggest fear? That the state could try to take the children away from the family. In private, fear crept into every conversation. The wives spoke quietly of what could happen if the police arrived at the door. The children sensed the tension, asking awful questions no child should ever have to ask. Will they take daddy away? Are we going to lose our family? Kody, the father who attempted to exude confidence on camera, was fighting his own fear. For him, going to prison was not a matter of losing his liberty. It was a matter of losing his means to care for and protect his huge family. The tension was constant. Every door knock sounded ominous. Each unfamiliar car parked along the street was suspect. And with each subsequent episode of Sister Wives, the anxiety just increased. The Browns were forced into a decision: remain in Utah and be in a state of perpetual fear, or abandon everything and move for security. In 2011, the Browns did something that rocked fans and altered their narrative. They drove away from their life in Utah and escaped to Las Vegas, Nevada. It wasn't a move from one state to another, it was an escape. For the Browns, Las Vegas represented freedom. Nevada wasn't actively prosecuting polygamous families, and that meant they could breathe at last. The move itself was emotional and chaotic. Imagine trying to relocate not just one household, but 4 separate mothers, dozens of children, and one father trying to hold it all together. They weren't just leaving behind a house, they were leaving behind their roots, their friends, and the only community they had ever known. On television, the audience witnessed the tears, the anxiety, and the devastation. Off camera, the consequences were higher. This was not about scoring a better house or a new job. This was about survival. Finally settled in Las Vegas, the Browns merely desired peace. For the first time, they could live openly without expectations of a police raid or criminal indictment. They could venture out as a family without glancing over their shoulders. They could allow their children to grow up without the specter of prosecution hanging over them. But Las Vegas introduced new problems in its wake. Money woes trailed along behind the family as they attempted to juggle the bills of several households. The wives' relationships complicated themselves in their new setting, and Kody's status as the head of the family was strained in ways he could not have dreamed. Nevertheless, for the moment, relief. The Browns had managed to outrun the immediate crisis, but the relocation did not heal the wounds of what they had suffered in Utah. If anything, it sparked a fire within them. Kody and his wives came to the realization that although they had dodged prosecution, thousands of other families who resided in polygamous setups were still in fear. And that's when their drama unfolded even further. For years, the Browns had kept their lives a secret, concealing their lifestyle from neighbors, employers, and officials. Then they had spent their lives in fear, fleeing from the law and the threat of prosecution. Now, in Las Vegas, they finally felt something they hadn't in a long time: room to breathe. But space to breathe wasn't sufficient. Kody and the wives made up their minds that they weren't going to flee anymore. They weren't going to live in fear anymore. They weren't going to let the state control how they constructed their family, so they took a bold, first-of-its-kind stand. They sued the state of Utah. This was no small move. By suing the state, they weren't merely defending themselves. They were taking on the very laws that made them criminals. It was dangerous. It was provocative. And it was sure to thrust them squarely back into the national media glare. But this time, they weren't fleeing from it. They were moving towards it. The relocation to Las Vegas was not merely a move. It was the catalyst that set off a fight that would immortalize the Browns. Had they not left Utah, had they not suffered under the unyielding hammer of prosecution, they may never have been strong enough to rise up and resist. In the years to come, their lawsuit, Brown vs. Buhman, would make headlines, challenge centuries-old laws, and ignite debates across the country about freedom, family, and where the government's authority should end. But it all started with one painful, dramatic, and courageous decision to pack up their lives, leave behind everything they knew, and escape to a new state in search of safety. For the Browns, Las Vegas was not merely a new address. It was a turning point, a symbol of survival, and the start of a courtroom fight that would rock the nation. The relocation to Las Vegas was an ending and a beginning. It ended the Browns' life of concealment in Utah, but it initiated a quest that would usher them into courtrooms, headlines, and public discourse much larger than their family alone. Their flight was more than a relocation. It was the spark of defiance. And once the spark took hold, there was no turning back. Las Vegas provided the Browns with something they had not experienced in years: security. For the first time ever, they were able to walk the streets without the fear of a police raid. They could allow their children to attend school without the incessant fear of a prosecutor at their door. But that safety had a cost, because even as they were spared immediate harm, they knew hundreds of other families like themselves remained held captive in Utah, living in silence and terror. Kody Brown, once just resolved to maintain his family unit intact, now had a new sense of responsibility. Sister Wives cameras had provided him with an audience, and he was soon going to utilize it in a manner no one anticipated. Rather than fleeing from the law, he was going to fight back against it. So, in 2011, the Browns sued the state of Utah in federal court, suing the very legislators who had labeled their family as criminals. The lawsuit was formally titled Brown vs. Buhman, a title that would soon be heard in courtrooms, news stories, and family arguments nationwide. At the center of the case was one question: could the government criminalize the private, consenting relationships of adults? The Browns weren't requesting the court to legalize multiple marriages. They weren't requesting polygamous marriage permits. What they were requesting was easier, but no less potent, the freedom to live together as a family without the prospect of prosecution. But to Utah officials, the case was not that clear-cut. They countered that polygamy has a long history of being associated with abuse, fraud, and exploitation. To them, the law was never about criminalizing love. It was about protecting vulnerable individuals. For the Browns, however, this was personal. They weren't a cult. They weren't keeping anyone in bondage. They were a consenting adult family raising kids in a loving home. To them, being equated with the seedy histories of polygamy wasn't just unfair. It was heart-wrenching. The stakes were huge. If the Browns lost, it would confirm the criminalization of their lifestyle. If they won, it could establish a historic precedent for individual freedom in America. While the lawsuit advanced through the courts, the Browns' tale again made national headlines. Media sources discussed the case, legal analysts commented, and viewers of Sister Wives held their breath. Inside the courtroom, the Browns' attorneys debated fervently. They asserted that Utah's anti-polygamy laws infringed on the Browns' constitutional right to privacy as well as their religious freedom. After all, the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Didn't that mean the right to choose your family? Meanwhile, Utah attorneys drew a different picture. They contended that polygamy was linked to systemic harm, pointing to decades of cases of coercion, underage marriages, and abuse in fundamentalist communities. They urged that overturning the laws would open the floodgates to exploitation. For the Browns, sitting in that courtroom was like a dream. They were not hardened offenders. They were not violent. They were a family who had made a choice of faith and love. And now, their lives were being picked apart, argued about, and convicted by people they had never met. In 2013, years after they had been patiently waiting, the Browns received their answer. U.S. District Court Judge Clark Waddups ruled in their favor when he invalidated portions of Utah's anti-polygamy statute. The court specifically held that the state could not prosecute individuals simply because they were cohabitating with multiple partners when there was no fraud or abuse involved. For the Browns, it was a breathtaking triumph, a time of vindication after years of intimidation, secrecy, and derision. The trial victory wasn't only a legal landmark, it was a symbolic victory. For the first time ever, the law appeared to acknowledge their family, not as criminals, but as human beings worthy of respect and freedom. The ruling made national headlines. Polygamy remained illegal in most ways, but the ruling pried the door of acceptance and protection a little wider for families like the Browns. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that the Browns had not only avoided prosecution, but had altered history. But courthouse victories are not often enduring. Within a matter of minutes, Utah appealed the ruling. The state wasn't about to let it stand, contending that it was eroding their capacity to enforce laws intended to block exploitation. The 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the ruling in 2016. The judges threw out the case on technicalities, holding that the Browns were no longer genuinely threatened with prosecution because Utah had relaxed its enforcement of anti-polygamy statutes. It was a devastating setback. The legal victory that had once seemed so revolutionary was erased. The Browns' struggle hadn't altered the law after all. For Kody and his wives, it was a sour pill to swallow. They had gambled everything: privacy, reputation, peace of mind, only to have their victory taken away from them. Again, they were left in legal limbo. Victories and losses in the courtroom may appear tidy on paper, but for the Browns, the battle had permanent marks. The tension of the lawsuit had a heavy toll on the family, widening the fissures already opening in Kody's relationships with his wives. Off-camera, conflicts became more common, jealousies intensified, trust was lost, and one by one the wives started to drift apart. Christine departed in 2021, Janelle came next, and finally Meri. The man who had once stood tall with 4 wives now stood alone with only one, Robin. Others speculated about whether the courtroom fight itself had been too much to bear. The constant media glare, the bad publicity, and the personal drain of years of litigation had all exacted their price. The Browns had united against the state of Utah, but within their own household harmony was fraying. Although the Browns' victory in court was reversed, their lawsuit had a lasting impact. It compelled the country to face uncomfortable questions. Ought adults be allowed to organize their families as they please? Can the state criminalize intimate relationships? And where does the boundary lie between safeguarding vulnerable individuals and encroaching on personal freedom? For some, the Browns are still contentious figures, representatives of a way of life many still regard as troublesome. For others, they are trailblazers who had the courage to defy unfair laws. What cannot be disputed is that their courtroom confrontation became a defining moment in reality television history. Few stars of TV can claim their saga remade national discussions about liberty and law. The Browns can. The courtroom confrontation was more than a legal fight. It was a struggle for identity, liberty, and life. For the Browns, it was a temporary victory, but the bravery necessary to defy the state cannot be denied. They didn't win and alter the law forever perhaps, but they altered the discussion, and sometimes that is where revolutions start. Would you like me to now break up session 4, use the cost of the battle, into 1500 words, so we keep the entire cinematic rhythm of the story going? Below is the complete session 3 broken up to 1500 words, keeping it narration ready and interesting to your YouTube viewers. Las Vegas provided the Browns with something they hadn't experienced in years: safety. For the first time, they didn't have to walk the streets in fear of a police raid. They were able to send their children to school without constantly living in fear of having a prosecutor knock on their door. But that security had a cost. Because although they were clear of immediate harm, they knew thousands of other families like theirs were still stuck in Utah, living in fear and hiding. Kody Brown, who was once resolved only to maintain his family intact, now had a new role. Sister Wives cameras had provided him with a platform, and he was soon going to utilize it in a manner nobody anticipated. Rather than fleeing from the law, he was going to confront it. So in 2011, the Browns sued the state of Utah in federal court on behalf of the very laws that had labeled their family criminal. The case was formally called Brown Vorp Buhman, a name that would quickly ring out in courtrooms, headlines, and family dinner debates across America. Central to the case was one question: did the government have a right to criminalize the personal, consensual relationships of adults? The Browns weren't asking the court to legalize multiple marriages. They weren't requesting state-issued polygamous marriage certificates. What they wanted was more straightforward, but no less forceful: the right to live together as a family without fear of prosecution. But to Utah officials, the case wasn't so simple. They argued that polygamy had long been linked to abuse, fraud, and exploitation. To them, the law wasn't about criminalizing love, it was about protecting vulnerable people. For the Browns, however, this was not just about freedom. This was personal. They were not a cult. They were not coercing anyone. They were a family of consenting adults raising kids in a loving home. To them, being included among the more sinister backstories of polygamy was not only unjust, it was heartbreaking. The implications were staggering. If the Browns lost, they would solidify the criminalization of their way of life. If they won, it would establish a historic precedent for individual liberty in America. Through the long process of the lawsuit working its way through the courts, the Browns' tale once again became a national sensation. News sources argued about the case, law professors opined, and Sister Wives fans held their breath. In the courtroom, the Browns' attorneys fought with fervor. They asserted that Utah's anti-polygamy statutes infringed on the Browns' constitutional right to privacy and right to religious freedom. After all, the U.S. Constitution had guaranteed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Shouldn't that encompass the right to pick your own family? Utah attorneys presented a different portrait on the other side. They claimed that polygamy was linked to systemic abuse, basing their arguments on generations of coercion, underage marriages, and abuse cases in fundamentalist groups. They cautioned that overturning the laws would open the floodgates to exploitation. For the Browns, being in that courtroom felt surreal. They were not hardened criminals. They were not dangerous. They were just a family who had embarked on a journey of faith and love. And now their lives were being picked apart, argued over, and dissected in a room full of strangers. In 2013, after years of anticipation, the Browns finally received their answer. U.S. District Court Judge Clark Waddups made a decision in their favor, overturning aspects of Utah's anti-polygamy statute. In particular, the court held that the state could not criminalize individuals solely for cohabitating with several partners as long as fraud and abuse were not present. For the Browns, it was a breathtaking win. A validation after years of terror, silence, and mockery. The victory in court wasn't merely a legal breakthrough. It was a symbolic victory. For once, the law seemed to see their family not as criminals, but as citizens worthy of respect and liberty. The ruling landed on the front page. Polygamy remained unlawful in many ways, but the ruling pried open the door to further tolerance and accommodation for families such as the Browns. For a fleeting shining moment, it appeared that the Browns had not only evaded prosecution but had altered history. But court victories are not long-lasting. Utah appealed almost at once. The state wasn't about to allow the court's ruling to stand, insisting that it thwarted their efforts to enforce laws aimed at keeping people from being exploited. The 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling in 2016. The judges dismissed the case on a technical basis, ruling that the Browns no longer had credible fears of prosecution as Utah had eased its enforcement of anti-polygamy statutes. It was a devastating blow. The legal victory that had once seemed so historic was erased. The Browns' struggle hadn't altered the law after all. For Kody and his wives, this was a bitter pill. They had risked all: privacy, reputation, peace of mind, and for it all to be undone. For the second time, they were left in legal courtroom wins, and losses may appear neat on paper. But for the Browns, the battle left deep scars. The anxiety of the lawsuit took a toll on the family, heightening tensions already developing in Kody's relationship with his wives. Off-camera, disagreements became more common. Jealousies intensified. Trust was lost, and progressively one by one, the wives started to drift away. Christine departed in 2021. Janelle did the same, and then Meri as well. The man who proudly held 4 wives by his side now only had one left behind. Other fans were left to wonder if the legal fight itself had finally been the tipping point. The constant focus, the adverse press, and the psychological toll of years in court had worn down. The Browns had battled the state of Utah together, but within their own household, harmony was fraying. Although the Browns' courtroom win was later reversed, their case created a lasting legacy. It compelled the country to answer difficult questions. Should adults be free to structure their families however they choose? Does the government have the right to criminalize private relationships? And where is the line between protecting vulnerable people and infringing on personal liberty? For some, the Browns remain controversial, symbols of a lifestyle many still view as problematic. For others, they are pioneers who dared to challenge unjust laws. What cannot be disputed is that their courtroom battle became one of the most iconic moments in reality television history. Few television celebrities can claim their tale remapped the nation's debates about law and freedom. The Browns can. The courtroom clash was not only about a legal fight, it was a struggle for identity, liberty, and survival. For the Browns, the victory was short-lived, but the bravery it took in defiance of the state cannot be questioned. They might not have altered the law eternally, but they altered the discussion. And at times, that is where real revolutions start. At face value, the Browns had done something amazing. They had challenged the state of Utah, battled in federal court, and for a brief moment, they had prevailed. To supporters, it appeared to be a glorious chapter in the family history, a victory over freedom and autonomy. But behind the closed doors of their Las Vegas houses, things were much different. The years of legal turmoil had left them with scars more difficult to mend than any courtroom loss. The lawsuit had placed Kody and his wives in the spotlight. Every word was analyzed. Every court appearance involved living again the humiliation of being called criminals. Every news headline pulled their children's lives into the arena. Early on, the wives held firm. They believed in the cause. They believed in Kody. They felt that they were doing something greater than themselves. But as the years passed, cracks started to appear. The pressure of being reality television stars and the stresses of the lawsuit started to bring out deeply seated insecurities. And gradually, the sturdy foundation of one family under God began to crack. For the third wife, Christine, the court battle only intensified the frustration she was already experiencing in her marriage. Christine had always yearned to be noticed, heard, and appreciated. But Kody's attention was more and more taken up with court appearances, legal consultations, and media publicity. And when he wasn't thinking about the case, he appeared to be investing what little energy he had into Robyn, the youngest and newest wife. For Christine, it seemed like the lawsuit had gained a higher priority than the family itself. Their quest, which was once noble, now appeared to be taking her away from the one thing she cherished most: love and bonding. By 2021, Christine was at her breaking point. On camera, she declared that she was exiting Kody. It was a surprise for fans, but for those watching from the beginning, they were not surprised. The court fights had drained her energy, and the fissures in her marriage to Kody had created a hole too large to fill. Janelle, Kody's second wife, was always the most practical of the three. She would generally pay attention to the business aspect of the family, the money, and living from day to day. When they were in the lawsuit, she had stood by Kody, but she also fretted constantly about how it was going to affect them long term. She watched how much it took from the children, how much constant stress it put on the household, and how it took Kody away from his wives. Over time, Janelle began to find her own independence. She started building her own career, making her own decisions, and carving out a life that wasn't so dependent on Kody's leadership. When Christine left, it really opened up Janelle's eyes too. She started to realize that maybe polygamy, at least the way it was going down in their family, wasn't going to work. By 2022, she also made the decision to distance herself from Kody. Meri, Kody's earliest wife, had been with him the longest. She had watched the family navigate every up and down, from furtive start in Utah to national television limelight. But the court battle only intensified the estrangement that already existed between her and Kody. Meri was repeatedly left in the background, not valued, and isolated. Amidst the lawsuit, her own plight was seemingly invisible. She remained loyal to the family, but she yearned for more. More for a relationship where she wasn't merely a legal footnote or a plural marriage symbol, but a cherished and loved partner. By 2023, even Meri realized it was time to leave. After years of devotion, she finally realized her marriage to Kody was over. Throughout it all, Robyn, the youngest wife, stood by Kody's side. She was usually perceived as the favorite, the one who had Kody's heart the way the others didn't. Throughout the lawsuit, Robyn stood by Kody completely. She agreed with his vision of fighting for the freedom to live as they desired and was prepared to go through the public attention. But even for Robyn, the price was steep. She watched as, one by one, the other wives departed. The vision of a large, cohesive, plural family was shattered. What they were left with was her, Kody, and their kids, a shadow of their former family. To Robyn, the court fight had allowed them to stand on their principles. But it had also left her with a family that bore little resemblance to the one she'd married into. The greatest tragedy of the courtroom struggle was the effect it had on the Browns' children. Growing up on reality television was already difficult. Their lives, their struggles, and their parents' arguments were broadcast for millions to see. Add to that the stigma of being from a polygamous family, and the burden was almost unbearable. The lawsuit only brought that spotlight more intensely. Suddenly, the kids weren't just reality TV stars. They were children whose parents were suing the state. Some stood behind the struggle. Others hated it. Many just longed for a normal existence. For the older kids, the pressure of the lawsuit and the inherent publicity drove them further away from the polygamous life. Some openly declared they had no plans to continue their parents' ways. The Browns had battled for the right to be able to live as they wished. But in doing so, they might have pushed their own kids to turn their backs on that very option. For Kody himself, the price of the struggle was high. He had entered the lawsuit in a blaze of flame and resolve. He felt he was fighting for his family, but for thousands and thousands of others like them. For a short while even, he became a symbol for bravery, a man who dared oppose an entire state. But when the victory was reversed, when the wives began to depart, and when the children started questioning the lifestyle, Kody found himself with a chilling realization: he had gained nothing. His vision of a large, integrated plural family was lost. His reputation had been bruised, his marriages had failed. And far from being hailed as a pioneer, many viewed him as a man who had fallen short of safeguarding the very thing that mattered most to him. The Browns' court struggle made the world question tough questions regarding freedom, religion, and family. But it also made the Browns question tough questions that they had never anticipated. Was it all worth it? Did they sell out on family harmony for a cause that was short-lived? And in attempting to vindicate the world, did they lose focus on what was most important, the love that held them together? For fans, those questions remain haunting. For the Browns, they are the painful reality of what happens when private lives are dragged into public courts. The cost of the Browns' courtroom battle wasn't just legal fees or headlines. It was heartbreak. It was separation. It was the slow unraveling of a dream they had spent decades building. The court granted them their voice, but took from them something in return, the strength that once came from being united. And when the dust finally settled, what was left wasn't a triumphant family standing proud. It was a man with one wife remaining, and a tale forever tainted by both bravery and loss. The Browns didn't seek to be activists. When Sister Wives premiered in 2010, they only had one wish: to introduce America to plural families and let them see that they weren't monsters lurking in the dark. They simply wished for people to view them as they viewed themselves: parents, husbands, believers, and above all, a family. But the suit against Utah thrust them into something much larger. Suddenly, they were no longer reality TV personalities. They were the faces of a national debate about polygamy, privacy, and personal freedom. Their lawsuit, Brown v. Buhman, became a landmark in the legal community, taught in classrooms and debated among academics. Even though the ultimate decision was adverse, the fact that a federal judge originally agreed with their position compelled many to reconsider just how much the government should intrude into private life. The Browns had lost in court, but in the court of public opinion, they had opened a door that would never fully close again. Before the Browns, polygamy in America was often viewed only through the lens of sensationalism or scandal. News reports focused on cult-like compounds, child brides, and abuse. Polygamous families who lived differently, consensual, open, loving, rarely had a voice. The Browns changed that. With Sister Wives, millions of people saw their laughter, their strife, their sibling competition, and their moments of authentic joy. They didn't resemble a vicious cult. They resembled a family, sometimes messy, sometimes dysfunctional, but decidedly human. Their lawsuit additionally broke through stereotypes. By standing in court and declaring, "We are here, and we are not criminals," they forced the debate into mainstream. Despite their legal loss, Utah legislators subtly changed their strategy. The state in 2020 enacted a reform that made consensual adult polygamy a misdemeanor, effectively giving it the status of a traffic ticket. It was widely interpreted as a trickle-down effect of the Browns' prominence and bravery. The Browns didn't win their case, but they certainly revolutionized how the country discusses plural marriage. But while the Browns shaped the world outside, their own world fractured within. Kody had envisioned a unified kingdom of love, a family united not only by marriage but by religion and devotion. For decades he taught that plural marriage bred more love, more support, more strength. But by 2023, it had all fallen apart. Christine, Janelle, and Meri had quit. Robin alone was left. What had once been a bustling plural home had dwindled down to something much smaller. It was devastating to see for fans. The same man who had argued plural marriage in court was now living an ironic monogamous lifestyle. And still, this failure uncovered another truth. Sometimes the wars we wage in public are less difficult than the ones we wage in private. The legacy of the lawsuit and the drama of the family's struggles is deeply personal for the Browns' children. Some have spoken openly about the challenges of growing up under the shadow of polygamy. Others have expressed gratitude for the freedom to make their own choices. Many have made it clear they don't intend to follow in their parents' footsteps. Their own stories provide the double legacy of the Browns' struggle. They paved the way for increased tolerance, yet they illustrated just how very challenging plural marriage is to practice. For the women who left, the legacy is mixed. Christine, Janelle, and Meri gained freedom, voices, and lives independent of Kody's shadow. Their tales have encouraged countless women to discover strength and self-worth, even amid heartache. And for the remaining wife, Robin, the legacy is one of devotion, but isolation. She stays with Kody, but the fantasy of a large together family is lost. History will argue how to remember Kody Brown. To some he will forever be a hero. A man who was bold enough to defy archaic laws and struggled for the freedom to live as he saw fit. To others, he will always be an example of what can go wrong, a man whose ego and decisions destroyed his own family. But maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Kody was both brave and imperfect, both visionary and stubborn, both a warrior for liberty and a man who couldn't even keep his own home life together. And perhaps that's the reason his tale is so resonant. For ultimately, it's not necessarily about polygamy or court proceedings. It's about what occurs when ideals meet reality, and when the burden of a dream becomes too much to bear. The Browns' case posed questions that extend far beyond their own existence. Should adults have the authority to organize their families as they see fit? Where does society need to draw a line in balancing the evils of protecting vulnerable individuals and respecting people's freedom? And what happens when traditional laws based on history conflict with contemporary values of equality and choice? These questions still hadn't been answered, even today. The Browns didn't answer them, but they brought them out in the open. And sometimes that's the start of change. While the courtroom battle is done and the family has broken apart, the Browns' tale still resonates in culture, law, and religion. Their lives have become a mirror, mirroring not only the challenges of plural marriage but the common struggles of love, loyalty, freedom, and loss. And though many will remember the legalities of Brown vs. Buhman, few will remember the sight of a family facing court together, brave enough to say, "We are here, and we deserve to be free." The legacy of Kody Brown and his family is not an easy one. It is complicated with triumph and heartbreak, courage and controversy, love and loss. They demonstrated that any ordinary family can ignite extraordinary controversy. They taught us that the law is not merely about principles, about rules, it's about individuals, and the lives those rules touch. And so, however you perceive them, heroes, rebels, or warning signs, one thing is certain. The Browns made history,